It's so great to see you all here. We're starting, what, 1 minute early? 1 minute? We're so thrilled you're here. Thank you for joining us. And those of you who are here for reunion, I was just here 2 years ago for my 30th reunion. The reunions keep getting better and better, I think. One of the things that we're so excited about is that this is a double billing event, which is you maybe feel you're getting older and older with your reunions, but you are not as old as the Honorable Yale-China Association, which is celebrating its 125th anniversary. And for that august occasion, we have concurrently a webinar going on. And so not only is it all of us here today in New Haven, but we probably have how many people that currently on our webinar from around the world?
We have 40 people.
40 people from around the world. Let's all give a shout out. Hi, so again, just remember Yale-China is celebrating an old reunion. And what is Yale-China and why are we here? Well, Yale-China was started in 1901 and has been bringing people together from the US and China and bridging the countries through really rich and impactful programming in education, health, and the arts for all of that time. And so we involved with Yale-China are excited to think about what those 125 years have been, and then what is the next 125 years going to be. And so what are we doing here today? I'm Jen Weyburn. I'm a current trustee at the Yale-China Association. And I am joined on stage by two amazing friends and colleagues who we've known each other for now about 30 years. And we're excited to delve in with you to the rich topic of the importance of people-to-people exchange in the current context of the US-China relationship. So we're gonna try to have just a fun conversation about important and meaningful topics for about 40 minutes, and then we're gonna open it up for a full community conversation. And that means not only those of you in the room, but we're also gonna engage with our friends on the webinar. So thank you again for being with us. And let's start by, I've told you I'm Jen Weyburn. I'm currently, my career is in education. I'm currently the head of an independent school in Brooklyn Heights called the Collegiate Institute. And I spent my years in education. I started earlier in my career with the great opportunity of taking the Yale-China Fellowship from 96 to 98, where I taught both at Chinese University of Hong Kong and then also at Ningbo, Huijian Shuyuan, a K-8 school up in Zhejiang province, Ningbo, and then spent 2 years working for Yale-China back here in New Haven, then went on with my education career. So that's a little bit about who I am. Very excited for my two colleagues to introduce themselves.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor and a delight to be here with the two of you and then with all of you. My name is Katherine Tai, class of 96. Most recently, my job was to be the spokesperson and the lead negotiator for the United States on trade policy with the rest of the world. And of course, in that kind of portfolio, the relationship with China is hugely important. If I go back then to Yale-China, Jen and I were colleagues in that cohort from 96 to 98. And for the year that you were in Hong Kong, Jen, I was the first Yale-China Fellow to be sent to Guangzhou, Zhongchang University. It was rather lonely that first year. I was a 70 minute high-speed train ride away from Hong Kong, the border with Hong Kong. And then the Lone border, and then maybe another 20-minute KCR ride from the Chinese University campus. I spent a lot of time with you and your roommates that year. I have to say that at the time, the 2 years that I spent in China, I spent both years in Guangzhou, were really hard. It was lonely. I felt very, very far away. That first year was particularly lonely. But I remember the time thinking, for all of the friends and family who didn't understand why I had taken this job teaching English halfway across the world, I remember saying, I can't really explain it to you, But I just have a feeling that all of this will matter someday, somehow. I don't know how, which was a source of immense angst when you're 22 to 24 and all of your friends are doing other things. But looking back from the vantage point of the job that I just left, the job that I've created for myself, I've just launched a nonprofit initiative, still to do trade policy, trade law, and trade politics in this current world that we're living in. I now see with the benefit of 30 years hindsight that in fact, those 2 years that I spent in China as an English teacher with Yale-China, lonely and challenging as they were, really did contribute directly to what I was able to do later.
I love hearing these stories. Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Stone, Director of Education Programs and Vice President of Yale-China. And this is my 40th anniversary of the first time I visited China. So I'm celebrating an anniversary. It's a reunion year of sorts for me as well. My entire career has been in U.S.-China educational exchange. And one of the wonderful aspects of that job is watching different people navigate and be in China and then go on in their careers. So actually, I first met Katherine when she was a fellow during that lonely year in Guangzhou. I was then at the Lingan Foundation where we were actually the funders through Yale-China for Katherine's position. So I went several times to China and visited her and tried to encourage her.
I've been wellness checks, but they were very helpful.
And then 2 years later, Jen joined the Yale-China staff. And I was then worked the Lingan Foundation had its offices in New Haven in the Yale-China building. And I got to essentially learn about Yale-China through Jen and her experience. And it wasn't until 2011 when I joined Yale-China on the staff and was able to kind of bring together all of these threads of having been in the field for all these years and then actually be a part of this remarkable Yale-China community. Yeah.
It's so fun just these past few days getting together with Katherine and Leslie and telling stories. I really think for all of you who have had a deep cultural experience in another country as a formative aspect of your early adult life, I mean, all we can do is tell stories, right? And Katherine, you were bold enough to open with some of the awareness that we might look back with rosy lenses, but when you have those initial experiences in a very different culture, it can be difficult and uncomfortable, but transformative to a person I've ever talked to who was involved in Yale-China programs. They were deep and impactful. I mean, for me, living in Hong Kong and from 96 to 97 over the period of the handover was an awakening to the power of possibility of connection through education. I got to teach Hong Kong University students at CUHK and engaging with them about their identities and their hopes, fears, and dreams as Hong Kong was making a huge transition. Sometimes it came out in the literature classroom. I was teaching them Flannery O'Connor. And I remember talking about verbal and dramatic irony when the main character was a bad person saying good things. So, there's this beauty in a classroom of teaching people who have different identities than you and using that opportunity as a bridge. And lo and behold, we would end up in conversations about how they felt both being Hong Kong and Chinese at the same time. And I just, it made me forever feel that cross-cultural, deep human connection in my work world was going to have to be where I felt I could thrive and contribute. And it definitely came from the Yale-China experience. I wonder other stories or connections you all are thinking about.
Oh, the one story I could think of was actually I was on a train. I was teaching at the Nanjing Aeronautical Institute, and I was a solo player. I was just on my own in China. I had no actual network at all. And I was on a train, and there were these people in the car who two were foreigners, and they seemed to know what was going on. So I went over to them and started talking to them, and they were Yale-China fellows. One at both, they were, I think we were going from Guangzhou to Changsha and then onward to Nanjing where I was. And they were talking, they had built up this whole conversation with half the train, sharing stories with everyone on the train. And then they pulled out of their backpack all of this food, and they had this knowledge and this awareness, and also clearly a support network and kind of a perspective on who they all were and what their role was, and that they were there to learn and they were there also to connect. And I remember being really jealous of them, which I think in a way it led me back to Yale-China.
When I think back to how I ended up in Yale-China, would take all of you on this journey back just a couple more years to being an undergrad at Yale. And I was a history major, which Jen, you might also be a history major. Yes, there were a lot of history majors. And maybe even today, I hope there are still a lot of history majors at Yale. I never thought that. I mean, I thought history was fine in high school. At Yale, I mean, history's opened up as a field of inquiry and narrative and understanding. We can't understand ourselves individually, but in the collective without history. It's a story that we tell about ourselves to understand where we've come from, and then that should inform where we think we're going. As a history student here, I sat in a lot of rooms like this with, the desks that come up, took a lot of notes, had the extraordinary privilege of listening to a lot of lectures. I felt like the history major was being a season ticket holder at the Met Opera, except that, it was your professors delivering this art form of the history lecture. And over the 4 years, as I got more mature here, what I realized was history is made every single day. And as a senior, I thought I was ready to go learn history out there in the world where it was being made. That I wanted to be able to translate the schoolwork and the study inside the classroom to the adventure that was out there in the world. And this was 1996. So much was happening in Asia and in China in particular. And Yale-China became my opportunity. And back then, there were very few opportunities for college grads to go directly to China. It was my opportunity to go and see history as it was being written. I think when I look back on that, it really was a hunger to be connected to the world, to something that you felt like was probably going to be important, but you didn't know how. When I was in China, obviously, I made a lot of friends with my fellow Yale-China fellows, other Americans teaching English in China, other Americans doing other things in China. I had some friends who were investment banking in Hong Kong. They were always good for a great meal. I'm really grateful for knowing that. And I think the students that I met, obviously, really formed my worldview. They were talented, so talented. Now that I look back on it, they were my age, but at the time I was 2 years older and felt very much like I'm the teacher in the classroom, but they taught me so much. What I remember from that time period was whether they were the students in my classes or they were students of parents who had really, finagled spoken English tutoring lessons out of me, that there was this enormous sense of motivation and of hustle, especially in South China, but I think probably across the country, and the sense of optimism and opportunity. And, that if you worked really, really hard, even if you weren't able to open doors for yourself, you could open doors for your kids. And that, I think, has changed over 30 years in China. China is different. But I think back on that as I have pursued a career in trade policy that has made my work really relevant to American economic policy domestically, and realize that that sense of optimism and drive is something that actually all people hunger for. And in this moment today, that probably more people in the world, in our country, in China, and in other places, are trying to capture or recapture that sense of vitality. So, right, it does come from being connected to the people in places that lets you bring that reflection back into your reflections about where you are today. And maybe a kind of a universal truth that everybody is willing to hustle in an environment where you feel like things are possible.
That all means so much to me, Catherine. I mean, it's funny, I was a history major at Yale, but sadly, given the excellent Chinese history professors at Yale, I never took a class. I was a very much American history, American studies focus, and it was only when I was 25 and took the Yale-China Fellowship. Your point about living in a place, it's sort of a contemporary historical cultural laboratory. You're making me think about my experience in Ningbo, the second year of my fellowship. That was a city of possibility and yearning. And one of my favorite memories is that it was a very unique time because previously foreigners who had worked in China in schools often were housed separately. But and at that time, many Chinese people were living at their workplace. It was the work unit. And we had a remarkable opportunity through Yale-China to be living in with the Chinese colleagues in the workplace. So we were all living in a dorm on the campus of our K-8 school. And so one vice principal of the school was responsible for instruction, and one vice principal of the school was responsible for giving us things for our apartments, like toilet paper, and being our landlord, basically. And so that living experience of the daily life of Chinese people at that time was so meaningful. I remember one day when we learned Titanic, the movie, had come out in the US, and suddenly we were all, as an entire faculty, all the employees of the school were treated to free tickets to Titanic downtown in Ningbo. Why? Because Jiang Zemin had said the Titanic, the movie represents good socialist values. And so this became a wonderful cultural, universal moment where I was in the English department. There was one other Yale-China teacher who was also American. But other than that, our colleagues were all the Chinese teachers in the English department. And my learning from them, we were all trying to teach English, but their lives were very different. They had never left China. The conversations around how values were portrayed in Titanic, and even conversations about the Chinese dubbing of the Kate Winslet character and the Leo DiCaprio character and what that did to their character. And then every morning for a few months, maybe, I don't know whether it was weeks or months, it feels like forever, on the loudspeaker outside of the school, the theme song of Titanic would be like across the whole campus. I mean, these are cultural moments you just can't make up. But the connections I was able to make with folks during those years, it was living history and living culture. So much to say about that. One thing I was thinking about was I had, as you have heard, had nothing to do with learning about China in any way before, not the culture, not the language. I started very much in earnest studying Chinese when I moved to Hong Kong in '96. You and I were polar opposites. You already spoke Chinese. For me, the awakening also to learning the deep depth and possibility of another language as a way, what is it Mandela says, if you understand somebody's language, you connect, what is it? I wrote it down, I love it. You understand, it goes to the head, but talk to him in his own language and it goes to the heart. For me, learning Chinese was a big part. How did you think about language in your experience?
Certainly. We were just talking about the program today, and we have someone in the audience today who's about to ship out this summer very soon. And I think Yale-China's program today is an immersive language training in China before the teaching program begins. And what an incredible opportunity for people who have not been exposed to then really and be fast-tracked in terms of opening up the worlds of being able to speak to people in their own language. It's interesting, right? So I grew up in a Mandarin speaking household. I studied it formally in high school. We're very fortunate. We had a Chinese language studies program in high school. I took more classes here. And let me tell you how useful it was being a Mandarin speaker when I landed in Hong Kong. In August of 1996, when we all arrived, my investment banking friend, Club of 95, took me out to a dinner at some fancy Peking duck restaurant. I don't know why we went there in Hong Kong, but we did. And we both grew up in Mandarin speaking households. And, we're very proud of ourselves for being able to order off of the menu. And we did it in Mandarin. And the waiter just walked off and said, I understand what you're saying. We had to shift into English in order to have our order be successfully taken. It was a very powerful lesson about China. We were in Hong Kong, right? All about the history of that moment in time. What's interesting is almost exactly 2 years later, I'm on my way out of China. My little brother has flown out. We've done a tour of Xi'an. We've gone to see the terracotta soldiers. And at the very, very end, we pack up my dorm apartment in Guangzhou at China University, and we take the KCR down in Hong Kong. We're going to fly out of Hong Kong. And at this point, the Hong Kong airport has been modernized. It was the old Kai Tak airport. It was downtown. And when you flew in, right, I think only pilots with certain training were allowed to fly in because you were coming in the middle of all of the buildings, and you could even see into people's apartments as your plane was landing. Well, the airport had moved out to one of the islands. So we had a very long cab ride to the airport. And in the cab ride, the cabbie is listening to language tapes, and he is practicing his Mandarin. And I guess it's just it's an interesting story about how you can arrive in a place, think that you are prepared because you speak the language, only to discover that it's not really the language of the place that you're in. There are all these layers there's just all these layers of culture and nuance. We may have had more similar experiences than not. And I finally started taking Cantonese lessons my second year in Guangzhou. And you know what? It was so hard. So hard.
Those tones, all those tones.
I mean, yes.
Yeah, I think it's so important from Yale-China perspective to be both open to having people who have language capabilities to continue and extend them, and also bring people who are just new to Chinese and Mandarin or Cantonese and immerse them at the beginning and then allow them for those 2 years to develop their language study. We've had beginners, we've had people like you who started with Mandarin and then focused on Cantonese. We actually have someone right now who is very high level Cantonese speaker. And then we have someone who, language study at Yale in Chinese is so amazing. And it really should stand very tall and proud of what it's accomplished here. That we're able also to send people who are non-native speakers who've learned their Mandarin only during their time at Yale, who already go with a very advanced level, and then continue it on our fellowship. We do have a current fellow who is in Shoning, which is in Anhui province, and he's focusing his energy, a lot of it, on learning the local dialect. And because he was a linguistics major, he's being really academic in its approach, and I think will make a great contribution to the study of this language. And so from the Yale-China perspective, we love all of these stories, and every one of them is individual, and every one of them, we hope someone will take the language where they are and use the language to more deeply understand China.
We keep just talking about the depth of connection and learning you can do in a program like this. It has been obviously a very easy sort of continued journey for me in education, because in Yale-China, I was being a teacher, and the culture in the classroom and the connections you can make when culture is at play and you're trying to make people see the opportunities. And it's a natural extension that Yale-China was rich for me in a way. I guess what I'm curious about, Catherine, is in your field, have you found that the fact you had such deep connection and immersion experiences, does it differentiate you in your work, your approach to it, what you see when you interact with other professionals?
I think it absolutely does. In let's say work for the government for the United States in this era, it includes today, but I would say right in this era, the U.S.-China relationship looms so large, and it's not an easy relationship. And I think by virtue of having been a part of programs like Yale-China for 30 years now, I have a personal, it's part of my personal history, the relationship with these two countries. When we were in China in the 1990s, it was all about optimism and opportunity. And right, there were all of these American companies setting up shop in China, all of the economic and business opportunities. All of that, I think, crests in the early 2000s. I think by the time we're into the 2010s, this relationship is maturing. The experiences are racking up. Things start taking on a more realistic tone. Of course, we survive the great financial crisis. There are lessons that China learns through that crisis about its own policy decisions, where it wants to stand in the world and how it's going to get there. Xi Jinping becomes the leader of China in 2012. A lot of people will put their finger on the election of Donald Trump here in the United States for the significant, I think, increase in confrontation between the two sides. But from my vantage point, all of that tension was increasing really markedly so in the period after 2008, especially from 2012 to 2016. And I'm convinced that no matter who won the 2016 election in the United States, this relationship was going to become more confrontational and more fraught. And here we are in 2026, 10 years later. And I think the question that I often ask when I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I watch the scenes that came out of Beijing last week, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, is for this incredibly important relationship at these incredibly high levels, how many people at that table have ever had these kinds of people to people relationships? And it's not to say that these relationships make you soft. It's not to say that these relationships color maybe your policy perspectives. I think that these relationships add nuance and understanding on your side to the other side, but it also reflects on an exercise that you have had in understanding how you are being perceived by people who are different from you and have different histories. So I think it's incredibly important, but at this moment in time, I actually think that there are very, very few people in the highest decision-making levels of our government who have had these types of experiences. And that might also be true on the other side of the table too.
Yeah, how do you, I mean, Leslie, you're in this nonprofit work of this deep time. I mean, what do you see in terms of how, I mean, Catherine's saying this isn't very usual right now. I think the numbers have actually dropped off, have they not?
Oh, it's a huge drop off. So if you look at study abroad to China, the U.S. study abroad, at your time, there were about 3,000 Americans studying abroad. Our program is not enrolling students in study abroad, except for their initial language study. There were about 3,000 Americans. In 2011-12, we were at our height. There were just under 15,000 Americans. So we were, I think, the fifth most sought after destination for study abroad among all countries. Now there are under 2,000 Americans in China studying abroad. We are below the 25th most sought after destination. So there is a huge drop off. And obviously people are not, they are concerned about China as a destination. So this is another aspect of the current times that is disheartening because it actually goes in both directions. I think there has been a drop off in the number of Chinese students who are coming to the U.S. There's still over 270,000 Chinese students coming here. They're the number two position. The country who sends the most students is India now, and India and China have been switched off for many years. So we're at a really important moment where organizations like Yale-China, and we're not the only ones, are really trying to open doors and awareness and share their experience, our experience, that actually when you get to China, the experience is the same as it was in many ways to what you experienced 30 years ago, which is quite remarkable. People are open and interested and welcoming and want to have foreign students and foreigners there. And I think people from China who are coming here experience the same thing, where they initially may be quite worried about their personal safety, and then they get here and realize that they can navigate the United States with relative ease. So, and ease of mind. And so that is, for Yale-China, we're trying to do this in both directions, but we are especially concerned about the low numbers of Americans who are going to China.
I think this sort of bidirectionality part is what moves me so much about what Yale-China is doing now, which has deepened so greatly in the years since I was participating. You know, this and to the universality of human experience. I moved over to Hong Kong and then mainland China and also felt lonely, confused, scared. And Yale-China now has a number of programs that bring Chinese fellows in education and health over to U.S. New Haven area, and they have the same feelings when they come here and we host them. You know, but that's also a big part of, I think, where Yale-China has been visionary, is increasing the programs where people come here. Leslie, maybe you want to say a little bit more about those programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most exciting things that happened in 2012-13 is we initiated the opposite but parallel program. So instead of just sending Americans to China to teach, we welcomed Chinese teachers to come and teach here in New Haven Public Schools. So since that time, we've had, I think, about 28, almost 30 Chinese educators who come to New Haven, who have taught at wonderful schools, who really actually the interest in the teaching of Mandarin in New Haven Public Schools has remained constant. Schools are very welcoming and eager to have Chinese as part of the curriculum. They teach here and go back and then teach in their classrooms after having had the experience of teaching in the United States. Most of the teachers who we bring are English teachers in China. And when they go back, they're able to infuse their lessons with the experience of having lived in New Haven, having had many meals of New Haven pizza, but all of those experiences. And one thing we've done here that I think has been very special is we've had ambassador families where local families adopt, in a way, our Chinese teaching fellows and expose them to their own family traditions and do even mundane things with them that are very exciting for our fellows. So that trying to make New Haven a real home for a year, I think they bring back with them the richness of that experience. It's like you being at the table with people who haven't been to China. They can kind of vouch for their experience in the United States and bring that into their classrooms in China. No.
I mean, I'm also struck that the Yale-China programs, and certainly Catherine and my experiences with Yale-China, were early career experiences. Like, and what we're talking about is like cultivating human skills that are going to be needed for whatever profession anybody goes into for the long-term hope for the world. I mean, Catherine, you've spoken a little about it, but what's the hope for the future here? What's the next high stakes summit between our leaders where we see progress and we were looking and noticed that person-to-person exchange was mentioned. Was it Trump or Xi who mentioned it, or both of them? They talked about human-to-human exchange. What would you hope for going forward?
That is a lot. I have hopes for a lot.
Take a piece.
I have hopes for a lot. On that human to human side, things are really hard right now, and I think it behooves us to just be super honest about it, right? We talked a little bit about students, young, early career people concerned about spending significant amounts of time in China, affecting their future prospects, impacting their security clearance chances. When I was a congressional staffer for many years, I'm trying to think, this would have been in the 2017, 18, 19, so during the first Trump administration. When you're working on international matters, you often will get invited on trips to different places on the theory that, right, being exposed to a place, meeting the people from that place, seeing how their governments work, and what their societies look like will help inform policymaking. And I remember being invited on a couple trips to China, and at the time, really looking at the agendas very, very closely to assess whether there were experiences on that trip that I could only get by going to China, because I felt like the overall political risk level was very high, and I ended up not taking any of those trips. So in terms of my hope for the future, it's not to go back to the place where we had very rose-colored glasses, because this relationship is maturing. But I think it's for the ability to break through the political noise, and it's real, right? Like the politicization of life is very, very real on both sides of this relationship. But to have more people be able to bring into the bilateral relationship, right, the political arena, actual experience, a respect for facts and real life that will inform how we navigate this relationship. And I think that can only be done by people who have opened themselves up to these types of experiences. Maybe the last thing I'll say, which is a little bit related, is I worked for members of Congress, and in the election of 2018, the Democrats that I worked for in the House of Representatives were suddenly put back into the majority in the last 2 years of the first Trump administration. And I was talking to my staff director, my chief of staff for the committee at the time, and suddenly our boss had gone from being ranking member of the committee to chairman, and that's a huge transformation. And he said to me after I became USDR, he said, the chairman says, in political life, you always have to remember who your old friends are and who your friends are from before you were anybody, because those are your real friends. And in a way, when I think about these types of experiences, I think that the real experiences that you have before you are anybody, before anybody thinks that you have anything to offer them, is a set of experiences that are without a specific agenda, that are so incredibly important to have for when you do become somebody to someone. That kind of authenticity is something that I think Yale-China is still very, very much committed to. This is the kind of thing that I hope that will continue to sow seeds for leaders in the future, for conversations to happen, that will help take us to a world where we can figure out how to peacefully coexist with each other.
Also meaningful. Leslie, are your hopes the same as Catherine's, or?
Yeah, I mean, for us, for Yale-China, my hope is that we can continue to do this work. We're one of a handful of organizations that are continuing. A lot has dropped off because of the bureaucratic hurdles of doing the work. It takes 3 times as much bureaucratic and administrative energy to do the same level of work. But actually, Yale-China, right at this moment, in its 125th year, is looking to expand. So we're expanding our fellowship program. We're looking to add, this is incremental, but to add a new site. So we send 12 fellows a year to China. It sounds very small, but 12 is 2/3 of the number of fellows. So under 20 fellows of our sort go to China a year, and our 12 represent 2/3 of that number. So it is quite significant. And then they teach about 2,600 students, and over 10 years, that would be 26,000 students. So the numbers, if you stick with it, add up. So adding a new site for our fellowship program is we feel a very meaningful and attainable goal for us. And we are adding, we have a taxonomy actually that we discussed, which is bite, snack, meal. And a bite is to give people a flavor and a taste of what possibly they could do in China and experience in China. A snack is actually going and experience during the spring break program, for example. And we started a new spring break program this year called Study Hunan. And we had 10 undergraduates and 4 medical students explore urbanization, healthcare, and education. It was a fantastic trip. We started with some academic pre-work in New Haven at Yale, with Yale faculty, and then brought our students. And in Yale-China fashion, when they were in Hunan, we paired them up with Chinese university students who were actually from the rural western Hunan part of China. So they could learn about the trajectories of these students and practice their Mandarin, because we're required at least intermediate Mandarin for the program. So that's the snack. And then the meal is the fellowship program itself. And we hope more people will be open and interested in the program. Our healthcare programs are also expanding. And next year we are bringing, and I want to make sure I say this correctly because I'm not on the healthcare side. We are bringing 6 mental health professionals who are coming to the U.S. to share and learn with the Yale Child Study Center, which is one of the premier places for looking at adolescent mental health. And so this is about best practices for supporting youth in crisis. And this is a critical area on both sides, a priority in China because student dropout rates and youth suicide rates are increasing. There are only 500 adolescent psychiatrists in China. So this is an area where China is looking for professional development. The US side really wants to learn and grow with our Chinese professionals. And that is a new program. And then finally, we're starting an arts program where we'll have an exchange of, we'll be sending 2 American artists to China for a residency and bringing 2 Chinese artists who will be in residence at Next Haven. If any of you know Next Haven, it's a local premier fine arts program in the Dixwell neighborhood. Really wonderful place. And actually the gallery is probably open today if you're looking to go off campus. So these programs and the vision for us are our desire is to open and expand as much as possible to do more within reason, within our capabilities as a small organization, but to try to kind of stretch as much as we can, because this is the time when this is most needed.
Well, we've opened up just a few ideas here, and we want to hear what you're thinking about. We're going to do this globally, so I think I'm going to get excited to field a question or thought from any of you, and then we might go to the webinar. Do we need to give instructions to the folks on the webinar? Okay, they're going to put their question in the Q&A function. Okay, anyone here want to offer a thought or question? Yes.
Great talk. I just had a quick question about the numbers that you mentioned that they're the lowest numbers right now. And I wonder if it's purely a matter of wariness on both sides right now about going, or are there actually rules in place also that limit the number of people that can go in both directions?
I think it's a little of both, but I do think there are fewer places to study in China because so many programs did during COVID and after cease to exist. And we don't have, for example, the Fulbright program is no longer in China. That preceded COVID, but has been an issue since COVID. So there's no Fulbright to China. There are no longer several programs specifically that sent students and teachers to China. So they cease to exist because of the bureaucratic hurdles, and so there are fewer pathways. I will say the Chinese, part of the Xi-Trump summit that gave voice to this problem, Xi Jinping reiterated his support for a new program called the YES program, Youth Envoy Scholarships, that whereby the Chinese government has invited 50,000 Chinese students, just 50,000 American students to study in China. This is a wonderful pathway, and I hope more American students will take advantage of this. We don't have, in the past, we have had initiatives, and that's a pull. We've had more initiatives to push more Americans to China. We don't have that at the moment. And that would be very helpful, I think, at this time, but it doesn't exist.
Sure. And then we'll do a few from the webinar.
Hi, thank you all so much for the talk. I returned to the United States about a year ago after 12 years in Colombia. And one of the things that I was really quite taken aback by was the difference in sort of just on the ground, regular people attitudes toward China. Because in Colombia, there are Chinese phones, there are Chinese EVs, there's Chinese apps that everyone uses, and nobody's voicing concerns about how the Chinese government is going to use or misuse information. There's obviously not the automotive industry in Colombia, so not a need to protect the automotive industry in that way, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm wondering from a trade, fiscal, economic policy point of view, what you all see as the advantages and disadvantages of, for example, protectionist policies to allow American manufacturing, et cetera, to thrive versus the actual potential, and I don't know that there are, but potential economic disadvantages of really closing off that avenue to sort of regular people of how they're interacting with and understanding of a culture. Because I guess the other thing I'll add is I was shocked because there were people that I knew in Colombia who had not world traveled. They had barely left the country, but many of them had been to China because they were involved in some way in a company that was engaged in manufacturing or whatever. And so it was not unusual at all for a quite, quote unquote, regular Joe on the ground to have made a trip to China. And when I came back here, I was really shocked. So I'm just wondering about the relative advantages and disadvantages.
I could go on for another hour on that, but
Why don't you say a few things?
okay, all right. Yes. I mean, that question is so rich and, Courtney and I know each other from being undergrads. She, was very involved in the Yale Political Union, and I see that your policy and political instincts have zoomed right in on, the challenges that, we are having geopolitically in the world and the impact on other players, the middle powers, right? So that's a huge part of what's going on right now. You're right. Colombia doesn't have its own automotive industry, and I think that what you're putting your finger on is the sense of, I guess it's what foreign policy people, and I have a difficult relationship with the foreign policy people myself, which is, footnote, but foreign policy people call like the great power competition, right? It really does manifest between US and China in a different way because we're the two biggest, economies, we're the two biggest players, we're the two biggest power poles that the rest of the world has to figure out how to relate to us, and how we relate to each other impacts how they relate to each of us, right? It's a whole thing. But I guess, this came up a little bit in the Trustee summit. I'll give you a longer version of this later at dinner. But when President Xi is the one who brought it up, and he made reference to this concept, this frame of the Thucydides trap. And I think what he did was he asked President Trump, how do we avoid the Thucydides trap? Right. So this is something my foreign policy colleagues in the Biden administration would talk about, and I would say, I don't know what that is. That sounds very fancy. I got other work to do. And I did a fellowship at that other school up in Cambridge in the fall at the Kennedy School, and Graham Allison, the founding dean of the Kennedy School, is still there, is very zeroed in on the US-China relationship, and has developed this idea that back in the day, if all of you did the Western canon readings, right, with Sparta and Athens, Raphael, I'm looking at you because you're the classics guy. Athens being the established city-state in ancient Greece, it feels very threatened by Sparta's rise. And Sparta's rise causes Athens to be triggered in modern language, and eventually they go to war. Right. And so the Thucydides trap is, hey, this has happened many, many times over history where an established power feels threatened by an up and coming power. The question that they did in their research was how many times has that tension led to war? And how many times was war and open conflict averted? And what can we learn from the averting of those tensions to apply to the US-China relationship today? So I think that a lot of what you are describing and how things feel different here in the US versus how they felt in Colombia, I think go to that dynamic of, well, the United States is Athens in this example. The question that I have wanted to pose is, let's take the world in its entirety. It's not just foreign policy that's playing out. There is, from my point of view, because trade sits at the intersection of the international and the domestic, the economic and foreign policy, there is kind of a Thucydides trap dynamic that is playing out domestically in America. There is a segment of our economy and our populace who have been the established power, who may in this moment of our history and our demographic evolution feel very threatened by the rise of women, of communities of color, of immigrants, and are reacting to that. And it's playing out in our domestic economic and political policies. I think that it is a hard thing to be having two Thucydides traps going on, but I think that they do relate to each other. And so, right, I think it's important that President Xi raised it with President Trump. But what I would like to do is to raise the question here at home around that second trap, and then how we figure out how to avert. And in that scenario is how many times has this kind of domestic dynamic resulted in a civil war, and how many times has a civil war been averted? How do we bring those two conversations together And what does that mean? And for the trade policy pieces, those are super interesting, but I don't know that they're universally interesting. So I'll follow up on that.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I work in technology and I work a lot with my colleagues in China, and my closest colleague and I have teenage children. So we spend most of our one-on-ones talking about that, the differences in education, and then we talk about like mobile apps and things like that, whatever. But I'm really struck by the differences in attitude towards technology and differences in education. And I'm just curious how you're seeing that play out in the different attitudes towards technology, towards automation, towards AI, playing out in trade and in foreign relations.
Okay, I'll give you a snippet, and I'm open to feedback on this. Please follow up with me directly. I was recently in a conversation around the U.S.-China AI race, and I don't know which part of the technology world you live and work in, but I'll just use this as an example. And the question that was posed is, are we, the United States, in a race with China over the development of AI technology? So first of all, is it a race? Second of all, if it's a race, are we running the same race? Is it a sprint? Is it a marathon? Are we thinking about it in the same way? What does that mean for what we're doing? But in having that conversation, there were a number of people who have done field work in China, have more direct experience of how the Chinese are approaching this technology development. And part of what came out of, and this is learning on my part of what came out of that conversation for me was that if you look at how the Chinese are deploying something like AI, right, it's they're deploying it in factories. They have more modern factories. They have built them just in general more recently than we have. They are able to capture more data in those factories because they are more modern, and they are using that data to feed into AI models. And maybe that the AI then that's being used in China is helping China become more productive in their manufacturing, which is kind of their particular economic superpower. And then in people's lives, this is also what I've heard, so anecdotal because I don't have direct knowledge, that in China, the AI that's being developed in the apps and in software are sort of more directed to making life more convenient for people. And okay, so I see you're nodding your head. For the way that we're experiencing AI, and I think that, think about what our superpower is. Our superpower is Wall Street, as an example. Our superpower is this like incredibly, generally unfettered capitalistic system, right? And so how I experience, just bring it back to me, how I experience AI and the development of this technology is as, a function to be maximized or minimized or exploited in the development of these very profitable technologies. And so, right, how, like, it's the data that I'm generating that's funding, fueling someone else's IPO and someone else's technology development. And I think that is contributing to different popular perceptions of the role of technology in our lives. If you feel like you're just an input into this larger thing that's being controlled by a small number of very powerful people, I think that the skepticism and the resentment grows. And maybe that's because we are in control of the AI chips. We have our companies have free access to those things. Maybe that kind of geopolitical competition is already kind of playing out in that way, but I also think it's about our systems and maybe what we're optimizing for in the way that we think about our policies and our economic policies in particular. So those are a couple of my initial thoughts. I'm not very deep on these issues as of today, but I think that this is also incredibly formative to how we're going to navigate this next period of time and what that's going to mean for the experience of Americans in America and the Chinese in China. And then as it spills out into the geopolitics of the world, it is going to affect the lives and experiences of all people in the world, even outside of US and China. So it's a critical question. And I am in the search to become smarter at it And I find that technology issues, I feel very old, and then also just incredibly unsavvy. So looking forward to being able to.
Also find you at dinner.
I mean, I'll just say you've also hinted on the topic that's the most fascinating to me, which is a universal thing for our friends who have young people in their households all around the world, which is how are we going to raise the next generation of young people? One of my greatest, most fascinating studies ever since Yale-China, but I've lived in China again and had the pleasure of knowing the most remarkable educators in China who are doing the most amazingly beautiful policy and dealing with many different contexts in a national educational system that is so very different than ours, but we're all trying to crack the same question of people for the future, citizens for our countries, global citizens. It's such a rich time to think about education and technology, and we know our colleagues in China are doing it with a different level and kind of resources and goals, but there's real possibilities for connection there. Absolutely. Let's take a question from our webinar family.
I'm actually going to conflate two questions that we have on the impact of people-to-people exchange and these kinds of programs. The first being that we've heard a lot about how these experiences living and working with China have changed the three of you, but we have someone wondering if you could give an example of how your interactions with Chinese friends or students have impacted their lives, big or small, good or bad. And then on the higher level side, how people to people informal exchange has led to positive formal relations.
Let me jump on that second one because it's something I've been thinking about. Hi Tom Perriello. When I was going through my Senate confirmation, it was a very special moment in time where I had all the Republicans in the Senate vote for me, and then all the Democrats except for two who missed my vote. They didn't vote against me. But I definitely, you at that point are on your charm offensive for trying to secure the votes that you'll need. And I remember having a phone call to introduce myself to a Republican senator who had worked for Procter and Gamble, which was headquartered in China in Guangzhou. And so during my 2 years in Guangzhou in the 1990s, I knew that there were the P&G people who lived there, and they had nice apartments in the White Swan Hotel. And the conversation I had with him was super interesting because this was 2021. We're in the height of COVID. That is also impacting, like the height of its impact in the bilateral relationship. And it was really interesting because I found that his instincts on China were at odds with maybe his party's public posture at the time. But the two of us, by virtue of having a common experience in China, in the same place in China in the 1990s, although we were doing different things there, had a lot to talk about and a lot to reflect on in terms of the complexity of the situation. I will say that, as much as I've said, when you look at the long table between the presidents and all of their people, and you're wondering who's actually spent very much time in the other country, this senator wasn't at that table and wasn't in those meetings. But I did absolutely see him in the delegation pictures. And that gave me some comfort that there's space for him to be on that delegation and bringing his experience. So I think maybe that's one response I have to the second question, just because.
I think on the first question, I'm thinking about what kind of teaching of English do Yale-China teachers do? And one of the things that's been the most remarkable in China over the past generation is the creation of an entire population of people who can speak English. I mean, it's one of the major accomplishments of the Chinese educational system, which is so different, as I said before, from ours. But what is it that people like us, when we go and teach English in China, offer? Because I found it years ago, our Yale-China fellows still find it, learning English is really important for an important part of the learning that our students are doing in the places that we continue to send them. And we would, and I still have encountered many students that I've taught in different places who can do the perfect TOEFL test, but don't feel comfortable with that activated conversational language. And I think Yale-China teachers, I found this with my students, from the second graders I taught basic English to in Ningbo to the university students I taught in Hong Kong, the comfort of, we say in oral language proficiency, it's the comfort with unknowing and making mistakes. That is a proficiency that allows people in whatever career to go on and be able to use communicative language. And I think that that's something that Yale-China teachers continue to offer. And also the joy of language learning and connection. It's the heart of, again, this global citizen thing. And so I've heard from many of my students over the years that we let them feel looser and more comfortable with the spoken English and the understanding non-British idioms. I remember English students of mine saying, "That's like taking coal to Newcastle." And I was like, "Where did you learn that?" Some old British English textbook. I'm like, so we all of us who've studied multiple languages, it's all about the idioms. So maybe it's also we teach current slang. I don't know, to our students.
This makes me think, one of the most challenging times, of course, was COVID. And we decided early on that we would try to get our fellows back to China pretty soon afterwards. And this would not have been possible without having those people-to-people connections, without knowing the people on the other side, without their trusting us. And the communication, it took months and months and months, because on the Chinese side, they had to get permission from the provincial level to invite our 5 teachers back. And the communication was so rich. And what was so wonderful is what they wanted back was that people-to-people connection. They didn't want to have the Americans on a screen. They wanted to bring back our fellows to be with their students in person, to experience the kind of classes that were so much fun, actually, and educational for the Chinese students. So that period was really special and showed the power of the ties that we had.
Well, we could go on talking all day, and we certainly will after this. Listen, it has been just an honor and pleasure to be with you here today. I know there's plenty of other rich opportunities for the rest of the time, so we're going to, I think, pause. And can we all just send another very contemporary slang shout out to all the people who are on webinar? Great to be with you today, everybody. Thank you so much.
I want to thank the Yale-China staff who made this possible, and a shout out to Yi Wu and to Kate Rosenberg and Michelle, if you're here as well. Yeah, David. Thank you.
We'll stay up here for a bit if you want to come down and keep chatting. Thank you so much.